and welcome. I'm your host, Cherie Best. You're listening to the Just Love Them podcast. Join me on a journey to understand and find peace with those we love who have left their faith. As you join us today, listen for the golden nuggets that this episode has for you. It might be something that the guest says, it might be something that I say, or it might be an aha that just comes to you as you're listening. Today, I have joining me Camber. Camber is a wife, a mother of 5, a part-time nurse practitioner, and most importantly, a disciple of Jesus Christ. She loves music, baking, reading, exercising, and spending time with her family, and serving with the teenage girls in her church. She has been a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and her faith in Jesus Christ has been her greatest source of joy and strength throughout her life. Welcome, Camber.
Thank you so much, Cherie. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here too. We got connected through a mutual friend, and I'm just so excited to have you share your story with my audience. So why don't you go ahead and just tell us a little bit about your story? What have you come through? What is your experience?
Okay, thank you. My husband and I have been married for about 17 years. We were both raised in the church. He served a mission, and we met at BYU. And we got married in the Timpanogos Temple and started our family. And about 5 or 6 years ago now, he came to me and said that he was struggling with his faith. And he said he wanted to take some time to learn more about the church and some of the questions that were bothering him, and also to investigate some other churches as well. So he did that. That was really hard conversation to have. And I kind of thought like, oh, I'm sure that this will just blow over. Like, we'll just look through this and just realize like how great my faith is. And he didn't. The more that he looked into things and pondered and thought about it, the more that he came to the conclusion that he didn't believe in Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints anymore, and eventually decided to resign his membership. And then about 3 years ago, he joined the Catholic Church and was baptized Catholic and is now a faithful Catholic. So that's kind of our story in a really quick nutshell.
Yeah.
Um, but that's the experience that I've been through. He comes from a family of 8 children, and they've all had their faith struggles. Most of them have left the church as well. His mom is still active, but his dad is not anymore either. And so when we got married, his whole family was active. Most of the boys had served missions. His dad is in the bishopric. And so there's been a lot of hard things with that too. I wouldn't say that necessarily he had his faith crisis because of his family members, but I'm sure that they influence each other, but it wasn't all of them necessarily leading for the same reasons. A lot of them had their own reasons. So that's kind of what we've been through. And
Wow.
now we're working to just navigate having a mixed faith marriage and raise our kids and both live out our own faiths as well.
How did you feel when your husband decided to investigate these other churches and you realized that it wasn't going to blow over? And then how did you get through that, or how did you handle that?
That's a really good question. It was honestly exquisitely painful. It almost felt like he was so excited to introduce me to these other churches, and he just thought they were so neat and so interesting. And I was kind of like, I don't like this. I don't want this. Like this is painful for me. And so it was definitely a mismatch where he was really excited and I was really hurting. I think honestly, I I had to really just cling to what I believed and try to find as much hope and comfort as I could. I think that now, looking back with more hindsight, like I don't think that I handled it perfectly in the time, but now things are getting better and I have a lot more peace about what's going on. And so I can speak more to like what my perspective is now than it was then, but it was a very painful time in general. One of the things that I have learned through all of this is that there's a lot of different ways that grief can manifest itself. We often think about grief as the loss of a child or a loved one or a parent or a friend or someone dies, and that's when you experience grief. But I've learned that grief can represent any kind of loss, even if it's a loss of a hope for the future or a loss of a relationship or a change in a relationship or anything that you hold dear. And so I really was going through the grief process through this time. And I think that anybody that's going through this and in a lot of pain, I think it's also okay to give yourself a little bit of grace because it just takes time to heal when you're going through grief. So I felt all the feelings. I felt anger and shock and like hoping that I guess you call it bargaining, hoping that he would change his mind and just all the feelings. And it was like a circle, and I would just feel them over and over again. And I think that things were getting better, and then I'd be back to feeling angry or back to feeling sad. And so I think that a little bit of it is just kind of, for somebody that's first going through this, it's okay to give yourself a little bit of permission to go through that process and to feel what you're feeling and to grieve a little bit. Grief is part of life and it's part of our experiences here. And so that was a lesson that I learned as we were going through that really, really difficult time, especially at the beginning. Another thing that was helpful for me, and I wish I'd done more of this at the beginning, was just recognizing especially from my faith standpoint, how much God loves all of his children. And I remember there was this one experience, we were both sitting on the couch having just grieving together and having a really hard conversation. And I remember at one point in the conversation, I just felt this like piercing love for him. And it wasn't me because I was upset and sad and really just so hurting. But it was God's love. I felt God's love for my husband so clearly and strongly. And that was something I went back to a lot, just realizing how much God loves my husband and everybody, all of his children, regardless of where they are in terms of what they believe. That was a really good reminder to me that even though I might be hurting, like God has this in hand and he knows exactly what my husband needs and loves him. And that's something that I can rely on and trust.
I think that was a great gift that God gave you, was to feel that deep love for him. That was a gift from God for you to probably to help you to make the shift that you needed to shift in order to the shift that you needed to make in order to have your marriage continue to be strong. I also really love what you said about grief. You seem to have a really great knowledge about the process of grief. I can tell that you either have studied it or you've done some counseling around that or something, because you really have a really good grasp about what grief means and how to get through it. And I love that you shared about to give yourself grace and to go through that process and just allow the process to happen, even though it's such a painful one. People tend to want to do anything they can to not feel the pain. To really get through to the other side, you kind of have to. You kind of have to go through it. There's no
Yeah.
magical way around it.
One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Lazarus when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, because I think it's actually really instructive about grief. Because Jesus, first of all, waits to go see Lazarus. I hope most of our listeners are familiar with the story, and I apologize. I'm not going to tell it in great detail, but when he goes to see Lazarus, he's already been dead. He could have saved him if he'd gone earlier. And he gets there, and everybody's crying and they're sad. And Jesus knows that he has the power to raise Lazarus from the dead, and that's not what he does. He takes time and he cries with them. And I think that that's incredibly instructive. Sometimes in life, when we pray for a miracle, God comes in, swoops in, and saves us and changes our circumstances or gives us the relief from the suffering that we seek. And sometimes I think that he just cries with us. And I think that that is a really instructive and important part of life. So I've always loved that story. And then, I mean, he does eventually go and raise Lazarus from the dead, but not until he's taken time to just be with them and grieve with them. So I think that that's very instructive. And I think that it's important for us to remember that when we're going through hard experiences, whatever they are, it's okay to feel sad or to grieve or to feel those hard feelings.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I was thinking about this while you were talking, that we've been promised that on the other side, when we get to heaven, that all tears will be dried and all sorrows will be healed. It's kind of like Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, only on a much longer in our timetable, a much longer timetable, that eventually all our tears are going to be dried, all of our hearts are going to be healed. I believe that he takes the time to comfort and mourn with us here. even though he knows eventually, our hearts will be healed.
Thank you. I think kind of going along with what you were saying, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned through our experience as a couple is going through this process of trying to learn to trust God completely. And I was just listening to one of your other episodes where you guys were talking about how, we're here in mortality and things are going as planned. Like it's supposed to be a mortal experience, and so the things that are happening that just feel so crazy to us, like that's kind of what it's for. And I just thought that was so great. And I think that we sometimes forget that God is the one that's in charge and we're his helpers, and it's not the other way around. It's not like
Right.
we're doing all the work and he's helping us. Like he's got everything in hand and he knows exactly what each person needs to learn and grow. And so sometimes when we see people going through a faith transition or making choices that are really hard for us to understand or agree with, I think that God sometimes will just see those as a learning opportunity or a chance for him to teach people in ways that they need to be taught. And so it doesn't always look the same for everybody. And that's been hard for me to kind of wrap my head around.
Yeah.
Like, I love being on this path and it's brought me a lot of joy, and other people need other paths. And maybe instead of thinking, oh, everything's going wrong, maybe I should think everything's going right and God has got this and he knows exactly what his child needs. That's been very helpful for me to try to think of it that way. I love the scripture where God says that I am mighty to save. That is his job. That's what he does. That's what he's good at. I can't do that. I can't save anybody. Can't even save myself. And but that's what God does. And so I can't look at this person and say, well, God, like you forgot about them, or what are you doing? Like you're bad at your job. Like he's good at his job. So he's gonna do it well. And so I need to just trust him that he knows exactly what this person needs.
Yeah.
So that's given me a lot of comfort and peace as well.
It is such a journey to learn to trust God completely. And I love what you said about it's not that he's helping us, it's that we're helping him. That is such a paradigm shift.
Yes. Yes, it is. And I think sometimes we just forget that. We think, oh, I have to do everything, but it's not on us. It's on him and he's got it.
Yeah. I love that. I have another question. You described how you were going through this very painful process and your husband was going through this process that he thought was very exciting, looking at these other religions. And how did you get to the place where you are now? Well, first of all, I'd love for you to describe where you are in your relationship now. And then also, how did you get to that place? Because that just seems so incredible.
That's a good question too. I don't want to discount. I mean, it was very painful for my husband to shift his faith and to come to the conclusion that the church wasn't true. That was a very painful thing for him, and he had to grieve that as well. But then it also was exciting, and he has found a lot of joy in the Catholic Church. There's a couple things that have given me perspective. One, again, is like I was saying about trust. And I've also come to find a lot of respect and love for people of other faiths. And I think that I have changed in such good ways by going through this. So I'm really grateful that I've gone through this, and it's made me a lot more humble. And one of those is that I used to be a really black and white thinker. And so if people didn't think the way that I did, I think I was very judgmental. It's kind of like there's right and there's wrong, and I'm right and you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Or, in certain situations, that's such an unhelpful and I think un-Christ-like way to view the world, where we're all human and all mortal. So that's been really helpful for me to kind of approach this with a lot more humility of, yes, I really love the faith tradition that I am a part of, but there is a lot of value and beauty in other faith traditions. And I truly, sincerely believe that God is trying to talk to his children in any way that he can, and that he does work through other faiths a lot. Kind of trusting that even though my husband isn't in my faith tradition, that he is still in a good place and that God has still got him where he is, and that God has all of eternity to work with all of us. I think sometimes we kind of time limit God and think, oh, like we've only got this short little life to get everything all worked out. And I don't think that he sees it that way at all. I think he has lots of time. He can get us all where we need to go with the amount of time that he has. Michael Wilcox said something that was really helpful that's kind of similar to what I was saying. he said, God speaks to his children everywhere in any way that he can. I have thought about that so many times as I've kind of pondered, like, why is my husband here? And I think that he should be with me, or I feel like we should believe the same thing. Why would God lead him somewhere else? I think that he has such a capacity to reach his children in such a variety of ways. And so rather than me always looking for what's wrong with this faith tradition or what do I disagree with, to look for evidence of God working through people has been such an incredibly helpful mind shift or paradigm shift to make, to
Mhm.
think what is good here and how can I see God's hand working in my husband's life, in the life of these wonderful people that believe a little bit differently than I do or worship a little bit differently than I do. And it's really easy, honestly, to see goodness and just the evidence of God's help and care and love in them. And I've seen that in almost all faith traditions that I have visited so far. And I just feel so much love for my brothers and sisters in Christ that believe a little differently than I do, but have so much faith and live their faith so beautifully and well. And so that's been really helpful for me instead of seeing as our marriage is I'm right and he's wrong, as we are both trying to follow Jesus Christ in our own way. It doesn't have to be the same for us to be doing good and for God, I think, to be happy with the choices that we're making, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. I'm wondering, so you obviously gone through this process of not expecting someone else to change, but you changing and you in order to make the relationship work. You've described great change and great paradigm shifts in yourself. It's a beautiful description, the way you've described it. I'm wondering how long did that process take for you? Because I think some
Oh,
people, sometimes we have these podcast episodes, and people are like, oh yeah, first I was this way, now I feel this way, and I feel peaceful and everything's great. But I just know there's people out there who are in the middle of the pain and they're like, how long? I'm trying so hard, but how long is this going to take? Am I going to be in pain for years? Can I get through this quickly? I'm just curious, how long for you has it taken to get to the point you're at?
that's a great question. And I think that, like grief, putting time limits on things is very, very individual. And so it's going to
Absolutely.
be different and look different for every person. I still definitely have bad days. And things are definitely still hard and we're still figuring things out, but I am in a much better place now. And it's been, like I said, I think about 5.5 years. And so I think it's been gradually getting better over the 5.5 years. And I still feel pain, but it's less and I found a lot of things that have been helpful for me. It can take years for some people. For some people, it might be faster, and for some people, it might be slower, just like grieving anything else.
Yeah.
I think that having things like your podcast, I remember at the beginning when I was going through this, I just longed for somebody to talk to that understood what I was going through and that
Yeah.
could give me some help, you know?
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
just really didn't have anybody. And I think that it would have helped me so much to have other people kind of be like, hey, did you think about it this way? Or, if you try this, this might really help you to see this in a different light. I think that that would have helped me so much to find healing and hope much faster.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I feel like in general in the religious community that it's just not something that, well, first of all, it's kind of new to have this. There's almost been like a big shift in the world, but then there hasn't just kind of been the support is kind of slow catching up to the need. And I think that's one of the reasons that I felt very prompted to start this podcast. People need a place to know that they're not alone, that there's lots of
yeah.
other people out there and where we can talk about it. And then, so I started the podcast, and then I felt prompted to start a Facebook group, which I just did recently, where people can get on and talk about, they can share their experience, they can reach out with questions or help where they have a voice, because here on this podcast they get to listen, but unless they come on as a guest they don't get to have a voice. And
Hmm.
it's not a place where you're in the middle of it getting that kind of support. So the Facebook group has been helpful for that I just started. And then also, I know I'm not the only one. In fact, I've had another guest on here who's also a life coach who coaches specifically people who are going through this specific trial. And that's what I do as well. And I feel like so God's putting these things in place for people because we do need that support, you know. And as I went through it, I didn't have anybody either. I had 6 of my 7 children who left, and I was so devastated. Like what you said, you described it as exquisitely painful. And that's exactly, oh, that's such a good description. It was exquisitely painful. And it's just really helpful to have someone to talk to who understands what you've been through, or who can relate, or who's come through it on the other side and can listen and actually give you ideas, which is why I really wanted to have you on here, why I have my other guests on here, because you've come through it and you offer hope. Like, yes, you can get through this. Yes, here's some great perspective, and here's what helped me.
Yes. And I love that you said that, Cherie, because you are a living demonstration of how God can take difficult experiences that we have and turn them into something good. Because you would never do this podcast or that Facebook group if you hadn't been through the things that you've been through.
Nope.
And look at how much good you're doing and how much you've grown as a person. Like, you're just such a great example to me. And I just love that you are taking your place of pain and turning it into something beautiful and helping other people with it. And that's one of the great things that God can do with our painful experiences. Sometimes the hardest experiences that we go through prepare us to do the most good. So I think that you're a living example of that. That's really beautiful.
Thank you. And thank you for helping me along the journey, because I couldn't do it without my guests. You guys are the ones that are like, we create a community. We all share, and that's how we help the people coming up behind us who are still where we were, you know.
Yes. So one thing that was helpful specifically for my husband and I was to go see a marriage counselor. And I feel like sometimes we have this stigma about going to see a marriage counselor. It's kind of like you only go there if you're like, on the a hair's breadth away from getting divorced or something like that. But I think especially for in a marriage where it's maybe a little bit different than having children that have had faith transitions, because the marriage relationship is a little bit unique, than that. It's been incredibly helpful for us to just navigate, okay, how do we communicate and how do we work through really difficult differences of opinion that we did not used to have? And so that for anybody that's listening that is going through something similar to what I've experienced, I think that that can be a really helpful resource that I would definitely recommend. One of the things that specifically that I've learned from the marriage counselor that we've seen that might be helpful for some people, and I think that this applies not only to marriage but to other relationships as well, is to think about when you're having hard conversations with somebody, to start the conversation with a place of empathy and kind of trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And so if you're going to say like, I really wish that you wouldn't, bring alcohol to a family gathering, say that's something that might be come up in like an LDS setting with people that might be in a different faith tradition or different path, then maybe you could start by saying things like, I understand that this is something that's important to you or that you really enjoy. And so I can see why you might want to do that. Just kind of whatever the thing is, starting the conversation with trying to understand like how do they feel about this? And then that way, that really paves the way for a conversation that's going to have understanding and mutual respect instead of coming in and just being like, hey, I hate that you're doing this thing and it's the worst. And I really love that lesson. And it's really helped me to think more about how does my husband feel about such and such thing? And how can we kind of talk about this together and not have it feel contentious or hard? And so that's been a lesson that I've been really that we've been working on, and that's been, I think, just such a good piece of advice for anybody that is having a hard conversation with anybody that believes differently than them. Another thing that was really helpful was this idea of fighting judgment with curiosity. There is a really great YouTube channel called Hello Saints, and it's a pastor that has been learning about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he's been trying to learn everything that he can about it, and that's one of his big things is to fight contention or judgment with curiosity. So he's always like, get curious, ask questions, try to understand what the other person is thinking instead of coming into it and saying like, this is how it is or this is how I believe. I love that idea of curiosity. Like, why do you believe this way? Why do you feel this way? Why is this important to you? And that can be a really helpful way to communicate with somebody as well that believes differently than you. To try to understand or ask them what it feels like. And then that way you're not coming into it with your own preconceived notions, but trying to understand. And that really paves the way for understanding and mutual respect as well.
Oh, I love those thoughts. Those are so valuable. And I think what you've shared is applicable, like you said, not just in a marriage relationship, but in any relationship, to come in with the curiosity and to seek to understand. I absolutely love that. And then the other things you shared as well, just beautiful advice. And about the marriage counselor, I totally agree. Like, I feel like anybody can benefit from marriage counseling, because what really they do is they teach you to communicate with each other. And when you can communicate in a healthy way, that makes such a difference. And it transcends into all your relationships, not just
Yes,
not just that companionship relationship. And so beautiful. And a good counselor makes a big difference. So they're not all created
yes,
equally, but so a good counselor. So get a good recommendation if that's something that you want to think about, is find someone good, get a good recommendation. And if anybody asks that question in my Facebook group, then maybe you could even share any recommendations that you have. Although I know you don't, I mean, it just depends on where you live. And a lot of marriage counselors even do stuff on Zoom these days, post COVID.
yeah,
So
they do.
yeah,
Which is really nice.
which is really nice, because then you can go to anybody anywhere. Yeah.
Yes, that is super nice.
Did you get to share everything you wanted to share?
I would just kind of add to what I was just saying about communication. I think that it's really helpful, to listen to people and to try to understand where they're at, but it's also okay to have boundaries. And there's sometimes when my husband and I will be talking, and he is a talker. He really loves to express things and to be heard. And sometimes it's too much for me, and I just can't. It's just too painful or too hard. And I think that it's also okay sometimes to say, like, I love you so much, but I can't. I need to pause this conversation, or this isn't something that I feel ready to talk about, or this is too much for me. And I think that that is also okay. And so it's good to remember that that's okay. And
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that you don't love that person, but sometimes sometimes you need to set a boundary. I was fortunate that my husband has some other friends that have been in a similar place as him in terms of faith. And so it's been good for him to have people that he can talk about some things with that I just am not ready to talk about, or it's too hard for me to talk about. And so kind of encouraging him to find other, like, I don't have to be every single thing for him. Like, I can't meet all of his needs by myself. And so recognizing that there are other people in his life that can help be a listening ear in specific ways that I can't be because of our differing faiths and things like that. And so I think that it's important to realize that you don't always have to keep yourself in a place that doesn't feel safe, or that is harmful for you or too painful for you. It's okay to have that boundary and still express love for another person.
I like that. And the way that you described having the boundary, it comes across as though I love you and I care about you. I'm not quite ready for the whole thing, and that lets them know that you want to be ready, you want to care about them, you want to meet all their needs. It's not saying, don't talk to me, I don't want to know what you think. It's totally coming from a place of love. And so I think that's a beautiful way to verbalize your boundary. There are times when you can't just take it all in. It's too much. And it's okay to have a boundary, like you said. And it's a beautiful way to put that boundary in place without being offensive or hurting someone's feelings. Love it.
Yeah. I think that for me now, I try to pray more that I will learn to love better than that he will believe the way that I want him to believe, if that makes sense.
So
Of
powerful.
course, of course, that's still something that I want, and I do sometimes pray for that, but he prays probably that I will become Catholic. So here we are. So, so I think that a prayer that both of us can definitely have is, I think God is always happy to bless us with a greater capacity to love somebody. And that's a prayer that I think is always appropriate and always one that He loves to help us with, truly. And so I think that in any difficult relationship, praying for that greater capacity to love is one of the best things that we can do.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. If you like this podcast episode, make sure you're subscribed. That way you can get the episode dropped into your playlist every week without fail. Make sure you've rated us and reviewed us so that we can have other people find us, and spread the word so that this content can help the people that it's meant to help, and that we can reach out and find the people who need to hear what we are sharing. Like we mentioned earlier, there's a Facebook group that you can join. I will put the link for that in the show notes. And you can always book a call with me, free 20 to 30-minute call if you want to talk. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. Camber, thank you again for joining me. It's been delightful to be with you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
You're welcome. Join me again next time for another episode of Just Love Them.